I concluded my last video talking about how brethren can work through issues, and I was thinking it's kind of interesting because in this chapter, in Acts chapter 15, as we wrap up our Bible reading, we have Paul and Barnabas who were doing great work together. Now in verse 36, it says, "Let us return and visit the brethren in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." So Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them. If you've been marking in your Bible, back in Acts chapter 12, and let's see here, I believe it's verse number 12, we read about when Peter went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark. So we are introduced to John Mark here in Acts chapter 12. And I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, that he was also mentioned, let me see here, I may be forgetting something here. I thought he was also mentioned in Acts chapter 13. I could be wrong about that. But nonetheless, we are reminded of John Mark here in Acts chapter 15, and it was also mentioned in Acts 12. Actually, I think I'm correct. Going back to Acts chapter 13, yes, here it is. So we see that John Mark had gone with Paul and Barnabas, but he left them eventually and returned. So now we pick up this story here in Acts chapter 15, where Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them. But watch verse 38. "But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them and had not gone with them to the work." So now we have a problem. Well, what just happened earlier in Acts chapter 15? The church had a big problem. That problem was resolved. This problem, however, is a little bit different. And there's a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. This doesn't have to do with salvation. This doesn't have to do with something authoritative in nature. Barnabas wanted to give Mark another opportunity. Paul is insisting, no, this isn't going to work. I think this is interesting. Paul and Barnabas did not hate one another. Paul did not hate Mark, and Mark didn't hate Paul or Barnabas. I think they all loved one another. But there was a disagreement between who would be the best person to take. Should they take John Mark? In the eyes of Paul, his answer was no. The text in verse 39 makes it clear that this was a big deal. It says, "And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another. And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus." One of the things to think about as you read that is that, one, the work of God is still continuing. Barnabas and Mark are still doing the work of God. In verse 40, Paul chose Silas, and they are going to do the work of God. And what we find is that they're strengthening the churches. That's how that's how the chapter ends in chapter 15. So at times, things like this can happen. When you read other books, in particular, I believe 2 Timothy chapter 4, if my memory serves me correctly here, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul is going to mention Mark in verse 11. He says, "Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service." So their relationship didn't end at that particular time. They had a disagreement about what was going to be or who was going to be the most effective in carrying out and doing this work. So I think it does shed some light even with our relationships and how we interact with one another. At times there can be some disagreements, but at the same time a distinction needs to be made when it comes to something like salvation or some other doctrinal issue that we saw in Acts chapter 15, and something like how Paul and Barnabas had to decide who was going to work with who and how they were going to carry that out. So it's a great study. There's a lot to think about in there. This is just kind of summarizing some things and me giving you some thoughts, but I would encourage you to go back and do some more studying on it as well. I hope this helps. Take care, and God bless.